Gregory Claeys' Dystopia, A Natural History, is a study of the evolution of dystopian thoughts as both a political and cultural phenomenon. The book traces the origins, development, and persistence of dystopian ideas across religion, psychology, politics, and literature, connecting ancient mythologies and modern totalitarian regimes to the imaginative landscapes of dystopian fiction. Clay's central argument is that dystopia, understood as the inverse of utopia, emerges from the recurring human impulse to construct societies based on fear, purity, and control, often justified by appeals to salvation, morality, or progress. His analysis blends together intellectual history with political psychology, showing how group paranoia, religious dogma, and the quest for social perfection have repeatedly led humanity into nightmares of oppression and dehumanization. The book begins with psychological roots of dystopia. Drawing on crowd theory and group psychology, Clays argues that mass fear and collective hatred are the emotional foundations of despotism. 19th century theorists like Gustave Le Bon and Sigmund Freud had identified the crowd as a regressive social form, a space where rational individuals lose autonomy and revert to primitive instincts. Clays connects this to the dynamics of political paranoia and mass delusion, showing how societies driven by fear of contamination or loss of control produce scapegoats to purify themselves. This psychology is at the heart of dystopian societies where the suppression of individuality and the worship of collective unity justify violence and tyranny. Clays then explores the religious and mythological precursors of dystopia, focusing on the figure of the devil as the archetype of evil and social disorder. In Christian Europe, Satan became the central symbol around which group identity and moral authority were constructed. Through witch hunts, heresy trials, and inquisitions, the church projected its own anxieties and guilt onto demonized others. Jews, women, heretics, and the disabled, thus defining itself through persecution. This fusion of moral purity and political control laid the groundwork for later secular forms of totalitarianism. The medieval obsession with sin, guilt, and the devil's presence in human affairs became a template for modern ideologies that sought to eradicate evil by destroying entire classes or races of people. In the second part of the book, Clays turns to the 20th century, examining how totalitarian regimes embodied dystopian logic. He analyzes Nazi Germany, Stalinist Russia, and Pol Pot's Cambodia as real world dystopias where ideological purity and utopian promises led to mass murder. Drawing on Hannah Arendt's concept of totalitarianism, Clays emphasizes the role of fear and systematic dehumanization in maintaining power. In Nazi Germany, notions of racial hygiene and biological superiority were pursued through sterilization, euthanasia, and genocide, reflecting what he calls a socio-germophobic obsession with purity. The extermination camps, where bureaucratic efficiency met sadistic cruelty, represented the ultimate manifestation of dystopia, a society that had turned the logic of order and progress into mechanisms of annihilation. Clays also highlights how totalitarian ideologies functioned as secular religions. Drawing from thinkers like Jules Monod, he describes Marxism and Fascism as political religions that place divine salvation with the promise of social perfection. Their rituals, slogans, and symbols serve the same function as religious ceremonies, binding individuals into a collective faith that erased personal responsibility. This total absorption of the self into the group created the psychological conditions necessary for atrocity. In Stalinism, as in Nazism, The individual's conscience was supplanted by devotion to an abstract ideal, the party, the oak, or the revolution, transforming moral duty into obedience and compassion into suspicion. Clay extends this analysis to the literary imagination, showing how writers such as George Orwell, Huxley, and Samyatin transformed the horrors of modern despotism into enduring symbols of dystopia. He situates Orwell's 1984 within the political disillusionment of the 1930s and 1940s, noting Orwell's deep distrust of both capitalism and Soviet communism. For Orwell, totalitarianism represented the complete colonization of truth and language, a world where fear and propaganda reduced humanity to docility. Similarly, Huxley's Brave New World depicted a dystopia of pleasure and conditioning rather than pain and terror, a warning that comfort and conformity could be as enslaving as fear. Claeys reads these novels as both products of their time and as philosophical meditations on freedom, individuality, and the limits of rational control. Throughout the book, Claeys insists that dystopia is not simply a literary genre but a mirror of historical experience. He connects fictional visions to real social and political developments, from the rise of industrial capitalism to the bureaucratic rationalization of modern states. The quest for efficiency, purity, and security, traits central to both utopian and dystopian projects, has repeatedly led to dehumanization. Claeys identifies this paradox as the moral core of dystopian history. Every attempt to perfect society by eliminating its imperfections ends by destroying what makes society human. In the final chapters, Claeys exposed the evolution of dystopian literature after World War II, tracing its adaptation to new anxieties about technology, ecology, and identity. In works like Philip K. Dick's Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, Claeys finds a continuation of the same moral questions that haunted earlier dystopias. What does it mean to be human in a world dominated by systems and machines? The post war dystopia, he argues, shifted from political tyranny to existential alienation, reflecting fears of mechanization, surveillance, and the loss of empathy in consumer societies. However, even in these more speculative forms, dystopia remains grounded in the historical reality of oppression and cruelty.